They said he was a killer. They said she was a disgrace. But in the unforgiving Badlands, labels don't matter, only choices do. When a wounded doctor and a haunted cowboy cross paths in the middle of a dying land, they don't just fight to survive. They challenge everything the world told them they were. And before the sun sets, they'll have to decide, are they who the world says, or who they choose to become?
The sun didn't just shine in the Wyoming Badlands. It hammered. It flattened the horizon into a wavering, distorting heat haze and baked the alkali dust until the air tasted like bitter chalk. For 3 months, the sky had been a pitiless sheet of brass, squeezing the life out of everything foolish enough to cling to the earth. Silas Vance adjusted the brim of his Stetson, cursing the sweat that cut grimy channels down his scarred cheeks. He leaned against the splintered top rail of the corral, watching the black Mustang stallion. The beast was magnificent, a fury of motion and lathered muscle, fighting the lariat with a desperate, heartbreaking terror. Silas knew that terror. He carried it under his ribs every day. He didn't use a whip. He didn't use spurs. He used patience, a commodity he had in abundance since he'd stopped hunting men for the Pinkerton Agency and started seeking atonement in the breaking of horses. He spoke to the stallion, a low, rumbling monotone that was less words and more an anchor in the heat. Sudden-like, the air changed. The horses near the barn shifted, their ears pricking forward. Silas didn't have to look up to know trouble was coming. He could smell it. Gun oil, cheap whiskey, and the arrogant scent of men who thought they owned the world because they worked for Thaddeus Thorne. Silas straightened, his hand moving with practiced, horrifying fluidness to the Colt 44 resting on his hip. He counted 3 riders cresting the ridge, silhouetted against the blinding sky. Thorne didn't want Silas's land. It was mostly rock and scrub. He wanted the springs. Behind Silas's cabin lay a small miracle of an oasis, a deep, cool pool fed by an underground river. In this drought, that water was worth more than gold, and Thorne, who owned the silver mine 10 miles east, needed it to wash his ore. The riders pulled up 20 yards from the corral, kicking up a rooster tail of dust. The man in the lead was Jessup, a squint-eyed gunsel with a cruel streak Silas had noticed back in Cheyenne. "Vance," Jessup called out, his voice scraping like coarse sandpaper. He didn't dismount. "Mr. Thorne sent a message. The final offer. $500 for the springs, and you have until sundown to pack your trash." Silas didn't blink. He didn't move his hand from his gun. "Tell Thorne the answer is still no. Rain will come eventually. Men like Thorne don't." Jessup sneered, revealing rot-blackened teeth. "Rain ain't coming, hermit, but we are. Next time, we won't be talking." One of the other riders, a younger, nervous kid, subtly moved his hand towards his holster. Silas moved. He didn't draw, not yet. He just stepped into the open, away from the corral, presenting a full target but radiating a cold, lethal promise that froze the kid's hand halfway down. "Make your move, boy," Silas said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "But know that before you clear leather, you'll be meeting your maker. And I'll send your friends right after you." The tension hung thick and heavy in the heat, thicker than the dust. Jessup stared into Silas's eyes that had seen too much death to be afraid of it anymore. He recognized the look of a professional. Slowly, carefully, Jessup raised his reins. "Sundown, Vance," Jessup spat, turning his horse around. "Enjoy your water while you can." Silas watched them ride away until they were nothing but specks in the haze. He didn't relax. Sundown was only 4 hours away. He needed to prepare. He mounted his bay mare, intending to circle the perimeter and check the fences before the inevitable siege began. He rode east, away from the cabin, towards the narrow cut in the Hem Nui, known as Dead Man's Pass. The heat out here was worse, reflected off the towering walls of red rock. The silence was absolute, broken only by the steady clack of horseshoes against stone. Halfway through the pass, the bay snorted and stopped, tossing her head nervously. Silas narrowed his eyes. Ahead, half buried in a snowdrift of white alkali dust, was a wagon. It was a light buckboard, one wheel shattered, looking like a toy broken by a giant hand. The horse was gone, likely dead or cut loose. Silas drew his Colt, scanning the ridgeline for ambushes. Nothing. He dismounted, keeping low, and approached the wagon. It was empty, save for a few spilled crates. He followed a set of staggering footprints leading away from the wreck, towards the shaded overhang of the canyon wall. That's where he found her. She lay curled on her side, half-conscious, the scorching sun having done its work. Her skin, which might have been fair once, was angry red and blistered. Dust coated her clothes, a dark, sturdy dress that was ill-suited for this country, and matted her hair. She was dying of thirst. Silas kneeled beside her, holstering his gun. He unslung his canteen, supporting her head as he poured a single precious drop on her cracked lips. Her eyes snapped open. They were blue, the color of the sky just before a storm, and fierce with an irrational defiance. She didn't look grateful. She looked like she wanted to fight him. She choked on the water, coughing weakly. "Easy, ma'am," Silas Rumby led. "Small sips, or you'll just be sick." He offered the canteen again. This time she grabbed it with trembling hands, drinking too fast until he had to gently pull it away. Thank you," she rasped, her voice a fragile ghost of itself. She tried to sit up, her movement revealing a heavy leather bag lying beside her. The clasp was broken, spilling glass bottles, bandages, and surgical tools into the dirt. Silas recognized the tools. Pinkertons often used doctors to patch up suspects they wanted alive for questioning. He knew why Duck when he saw it. "A doctor?" he asked, surprised. "Out here?" She lifted her chin, a flicker of pride igniting in her shadowed eyes. "Dr. Clara Bowden, and I can walk." She tried to prove it, pushing herself up from the rock wall. Her legs, weak and traitorous, immediately buckled. Silas caught her before she hit the sand. She stiffened at the physical contact, an instinctive recoil from a stranger's touch. She looked up at him, really looked at him, seeing the grim set of his jaw, the hard scars, the gun on his hip. She saw exactly what the world had told her Silas Vance was, a dangerous man. And Silas looked at her, seeing the dust, the broken medical bag, the defiant blue eyes. He saw exactly what the world had told him Clara Bowden was, a woman of no account, disgraced and abandoned. "You can't walk, Dr. Bowden," Silas said, pulling her arms around his neck and lifting her into a bridal carry. She was terrifyingly light. "Thaddeus Thorne and his boys are coming at sundown to burn me out. I got about 4 hours to build a fortress, and now I got you to patch up." He carried her to his mare, the heat of the afternoon pressing down on them both. "I didn't ask you to stake your future on me, cowboy," she whispered against his shoulder, her defiance flaring one last time before exhaustion took her. Silas looked back at the canyon walls, towards the cabin where his whole solitary world was about to end. "I ain't staking it on you, ma'am," he replied, mounting the horse with her in his arms. "I'm just betting you got a heart tough enough to survive Montana. And mine might just need a doctor before this day is done." He rode back towards the cabin, into the blazing heart of the sundown, two ghosts carrying their own deaths, searching for a miracle of water in the wasteland. Consciousness returned to Clara Bowden, not as a gentle waking, but as a violent resurfacing from a dark, suffocating ocean. Her first sensation was the lingering phantom of sand in her throat, followed immediately by the cool, impossible slickness of damp cloth against her forehead. She gasped, her lungs expanding painfully against her ribs, and her eyes flew open to a ceiling of rough-hewn, darkened pine. The heat was still there, a heavy, oppressive weight pressing down on the cabin, but it lacked the murderous, blinding intensity of the open canyon. It smelled differently here, too. The sharp, alkaline tang of the Badlands dust was overpowered by the distinct masculine scents of leather, strong black coffee, and the sharp, metallic bite of gun oil. Clara tried to sit up, but her muscles screamed in protest, weak and trembling like overstretched wire. "Stay down!" The voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Clara turned her head, wincing as her stiff neck popped. Silas Vance was sitting at a heavy oak table in the center of the single-room cabin. He had discarded his dust-caked coat and was stripped down to a sweat-stained linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and crisscrossed with faded, jagged white scars. In his hands, he held a Winchester repeating rifle, methodically cleaning the action with a rag and a small pot of oil. Spread out on the table before him was a terrifying arsenal. 2 Colt revolvers, boxes of brass ammunition gleaming dully in the dim light, a double-barreled shotgun, and a heavy hunting knife. "You drank too much too fast," Silas said, not looking up from the Winchester. His hands moved with a mechanical, practiced precision. "Your stomach needs time to remember what water is. There's a tin cup on the stool beside you. Take a sip. Just one." Clara looked to her right. A dented tin cup sat on a 3-legged stool, beads of condensation weeping down its sides. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She reached for it with a shaking hand, her fingers gripping the metal tightly. She brought it to her cracked lips and allowed a single, agonizingly sweet mouthful of water to slide down her throat. It tasted of earth and iron, and it was absolute perfection. "Where?" Her voice was a dry croak. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Where is my bag?" Silas nodded toward the foot of the narrow cot she was lying on. "Everything you had on the ground is in there. Some of the glass bottles broke. I salvaged what I could. I ain't a doctor, but I know better than to leave medical supplies in the dirt." Clara shifted her legs, feeling the familiar, reassuring weight of her leather satchel resting against her shins. She exhaled a long, shaky breath, some of the panic subsiding. She was a woman alone in the wilderness with a heavily armed stranger, but a doctor with her bag was never truly defenseless. It was her identity, her purpose, her armor against a world that constantly told her she did not belong. "You're Silas Vance," she said, her mind slowly piecing together the fragmented memories of the canyon. The heat, the horse dying, the shadow blocking the sun. "I ain't staking my future on you, ma'am." Silas finally looked up. His eyes were a startling pale gray, the color of gun smoke, and they held a profound, weary stillness. "I am. And you are expecting a war." She gestured weakly toward the table covered in weaponry. "I'm expecting Thaddeus Thorne's men," Silas corrected, slamming the lever of the Winchester shut with a sharp metallic clack that made Clara flinch. "Which is close enough to a war. Thorne wants this land. More accurately, he wants the water beneath it. He sent a warning this morning. Sundown is his deadline." Clara glanced toward the cabin's single window. Heavy wooden shutters had been pulled shut and barred with thick iron brackets, leaving only narrow vertical slits for light and rifle barrels. Thin shafts of late-afternoon sun sliced through the dust motes in the air, painting bright stripes across the floorboards. "What time is it?" she asked, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "About an hour left till the sun hits the ridge," Silas replied calmly. He began shoving brass cartridges through the loading gate of the Winchester, his thumb pressing them home with rhythmic clicks. "You picked a hell of a day to take a stroll through Dead Man's Pass, Dr. Bowden." "I wasn't strolling, my wagon axle snapped." Clara swung her legs over the edge of the cot, fighting through a wave of dizziness. She gripped the edge of the mattress, forcing herself to stay upright. "I was driven out of Cheyenne." Silas paused in his loading, raising a dark eyebrow. "Cheyenne is a long way to run. Must have been a powerful, angry mob." "They were." Clara's jaw tightened, the memory of the flames and the shouting still fresh and raw. "A man was brought to my clinic, a stagecoach robber, they said. He had a bullet lodged near his spine. The town doctor, a man who bought his degree through the mail, refused to touch him, said let the criminal die. I took him in. I performed the surgery. I saved his life." Silas watched her, his expression unreadable. And the town didn't care much for you saving a man they were planning to hang. They cared even less that a woman dared to prove their beloved male physician incompetent, Clara said bitterly. They burned my clinic to the ground that night. The sheriff gave me an hour to leave town or hang alongside my patient. I bought a wagon and headed west, hoping to reach San Francisco. Then the drought, the axle. She trailed off, looking at her dusty boots. And now I am a burden to a man preparing for a siege. Silas set the fully loaded Winchester on the table. He stood up, a towering figure in the small cabin, and walked over to a cast-iron pump at the sink. He worked the handle, the screech of metal echoing loudly until clear, cool water gushed into a tin basin. "You aren't a burden, Doctor," Silas said, splashing water over his face and neck. "You're just bad luck. I've had worse." He grabbed a towel and dried his face, then turned to her. "But you need to understand something. When the shooting starts, you stay on the floor. Behind the stove is the thickest logs. You don't scream, you don't stand up, and you don't try to help me fight. I've spent 10 years keeping people alive by killing other people. I know my business. Do you understand?" It was a command, delivered with the cold authority of a man who had commanded men in life-or-death situations. But Clara Bowden had not survived medical school in Boston, and she had not survived the prejudice of Cheyenne by taking orders from men who thought she was fragile. She stood up. Her knees wobbled precariously, but she locked them in place, drawing herself up to her full, albeit modest, height. "I understand your business, Mr. Vance," Clara said, her voice dropping the raspy weakness, replacing it with the crisp, authoritative tone she used in the operating theater. "Now you will understand mine." She reached down, grabbed the handles of her leather medical bag, and hoisted it onto the table right next to his revolvers. "I am not a soldier," Clara continued, unbuckling the leather straps. "I will not shoot a gun. I abhor violence in all its forms. But I am a physician, and my business is fixing the damage your business causes." Silas stared at her, genuinely taken aback. Most people, men and women alike, shrank away from him when he used his Pinkerton voice. This bruised, dehydrated woman was looking at him with an intensity that rivaled his own. Clara opened the bag. The scent of carbolic acid, ether, and dried lavender wafted into the room, competing with the gun oil. She began sorting through the surviving bottles, checking her bandages, arranging her surgical steel instruments on a clean piece of cloth she laid over the table's rough surface. "If Thaddeus Thorne's men are as dangerous as you imply," Clara said without looking at him, "there is a high probability of trauma. Gunshot wounds, lacerations, concussions. You are one man. If you are incapacitated, we both die. Therefore, keeping you functional is my primary objective." She turned to face him, her blue eyes scanning his physique with a clinical, detached professionalism that made Silas feel strangely exposed. "Take off your shirt," she ordered. Silas blinked. "Excuse me?" "You are favoring your left shoulder," Clara noted, gesturing vaguely toward his arm. "Your movements are fluid, but you unconsciously hesitate before lifting anything heavy with your left hand. Furthermore, your pallor suggests chronic pain, not just heat exhaustion. If you're going into a firefight, I need to know your physical limitations. Shirt off." For a long moment, Silas Vance, the man who had faced down outlaws, rustlers, and killers without breaking a sweat, stood frozen, entirely outmaneuvered by a woman half his size. A slow, rusty sound escaped his chest. It took Clara a second to realize it was a chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned," Silas muttered. He reached up and began unbuttoning his shirt. He pulled it off his shoulders and tossed it onto a chair. Clara stepped closer, her medical instincts completely overriding her previous fear. The landscape of Silas Vance's torso was a brutal map of violence. There were bullet-grazed scars, deep knife slashes that had healed into thick keloids, and the distinct puckered entry and exit marks of a high-caliber gunshot wound on his right side. But her eyes zeroed in on his left shoulder. The muscle there was knotted, tight, and unnaturally swollen. A jagged, older scar ran across the collarbone. "Sit on the stool," she instructed. Silas complied. Clara moved behind him. She raised her hands, hesitating for a fraction of a second before placing her palms firmly against his bare skin. Silas stiffened slightly. Her hands were small, but they were remarkably strong, her fingers digging expertly into the rigid muscles of his trapezius and deltoid. "Old injury?" Clara asked, her thumbs finding the center of the knotted tissue. 5 years ago, Silas grunted, his voice tight. "A rustler down in Texas got lucky with a scattergun. Took a load of buckshot to the shoulder. Doc dug out most of it, but said a few pellets were too deep to risk cutting. And it flares up in the heat or when you're under stress," Clara deduced, her fingers tracing the scar tissue. "The remaining lead is pressing against the nerve cluster. It's causing muscle spasms. That's why you're favoring it. Can you fix it?" "Not without a scalpel, a clean operating room, and an hour of your time," Clara said honestly. "Which we do not have. But I can relieve the immediate tension." She stepped away to her bag and retrieved a small, dark glass bottle. She unstoppered it, poured a few drops of pungent, camphor-smelling oil into her palms and rubbed them together. She returned to Silas and began to massage the oil deeply into his shoulder. She didn't use the gentle, soothing motions of a wife comforting a husband. She used the firm, agonizingly precise pressure of a physician breaking down cramped muscle fibers. Silas gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles jumping, but he didn't pull away. "You have strong hands, Doc," he breathed, his eyes closed. "I have to hold down screaming men while I amputate limbs," Clara replied evenly. "Hand strength is a prerequisite." As she worked, the silence in the cabin stretched, no longer hostile, but heavy with a sudden, unspoken intimacy. The barrier of mistrust was not gone, but it had thinned. They were two outcasts, cornered in a wooden box in the middle of a wasteland, relying on each other's specific set of skills to survive the coming night. Clara felt the muscle beneath her fingers finally yield, softening with a sudden release of tension. Silas let out a long, ragged exhale, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. "Better?" she asked, stepping back and wiping her hands on a cloth. Silas rolled his left shoulder. The hesitation was gone. The movement was smooth, predatory. He looked at her over his shoulder, his gray eyes reflecting the fading amber light from the window slits. "Much," he said softly. "I owe you, Clara Bowden." "You can repay me by keeping those men from shooting me," Clara replied, turning back to her bag to organize her bandages. "I have a lot of lives left to save in this world, Mr. Vance. I do not intend to die in Wyoming." Silas stood up, picking up his shirt. "Nobody dies today, Doc. Not us, anyway." He walked over to the heavy front door. He pulled a massive iron crossbar from the corner and slammed it into the iron brackets across the wood. The sound was horribly final. A tomb being sealed. "Sun's hitting the ridge," Silas announced, picking up the Winchester and jacking around into the chamber. "Get behind the stove." The transition from day to dusk in the Badlands was not a gentle fading of light. It was a dramatic, violent bleeding of colors. The sky bruised into vibrant shades of violet, blood orange, and angry magenta. The heat did not dissipate with the sun. Instead, it seemed to rise from the baked earth, trapping the canyon in a stifling, breathless oven. Inside the cabin, the gloom was absolute, save for the thin ribbons of fiery light cutting through the shutter slats. Clara crouched behind the massive cast-iron cooking stove, just as Silas had ordered. The metal radiated a residual warmth that she didn't need, making sweat prickle along her hairline. Her medical bag was open on the floor beside her, bandages pre-cut, a bottle of carbolic acid unstoppered, surgical scissors resting on a clean cloth. She was a soldier in her own right, manning a station of mercy in a house built for war. Silas stood at the front window, peering through the narrow slit, still as a statue carved from the canyon rock. The Winchester rested easily in his hands, the barrel resting against the wooden sill. The silence was agonizing. Clara could hear her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird-like flutter. She could hear the slow, rhythmic tick-tick-tick of Silas's pocket watch resting on the table. Then she heard the horses. It started as a low, rhythmic vibration in the floorboards, growing steadily into the distinct crunching thud of hooves on hard-packed dirt and gravel. Many hooves. "How many?" Clara whispered, her voice barely carrying across the room. "6," Silas replied, his voice devoid of any inflection. It was the voice of a man reading a grocery list. Jessup brought friends. Thorne must have opened his purse wide. Outside, the horses came to a halt. The dust they kicked up drifted through the window slits, catching the last rays of the sun like suspended gold flakes. "Vance!" The voice belonged to Jessup. It sounded closer than before, echoing off the canyon walls. It was dripping with false bravado, the arrogance of a man who believed numbers guaranteed victory. "Sun's down, Hermit," Jessup called out. "Mr. Thorne's patience has run dry. You come on out here with your hands empty, and we'll let you walk away. You can keep the horse you ride. The rest, the land, the water, the Mustangs, belongs to Thorne now." Silas didn't answer. He smoothly shifted his stance, bringing the rifle butt flush against his shoulder, his eye aligned perfectly with the iron sights. "I know you're in there, Vance," Jessup shouted, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. "Don't be a fool. You're one man against 6. You want to die over a puddle of water?" Still, Silas remained silent. Clara watched him, terrified by his stillness. He wasn't negotiating. He was waiting. "All right, boys," Jessup's voice barked. "Light it up." The world exploded. The deafening roar of gunfire shattered the canyon's silence. Bullets slammed into the heavy log walls of the cabin with the sound of sledgehammers. Wood splintered and flew inward. Dust rained from the ceiling. The concussive noise in the enclosed space was physically painful, like a physical blow to the ears. Clara curled into a tight ball behind the stove, covering her ears with her hands, pressing her face against her knees. She had heard gunshots before in Cheyenne, but nothing like this coordinated, relentless barrage. It was a storm of lead designed to tear the cabin, and anyone inside it, to shreds. Through the deafening roar, Silas Vance went to work. He didn't fire blindly. He didn't waste ammunition. He waited for a break in the volley, a fraction of a second when the attackers paused to lever fresh rounds into their rifles. Crack, clack, crack, clack, crack, clack. Silas fired 3 times in rapid succession, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder. The sound of his rifle was sharper, more authoritative than the attackers' weapons. Outside, a man screamed, a high, wet sound of sudden agony, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the dirt. "He got Miller!" someone yelled from outside. "Cover the window!" The incoming fire intensified, concentrating on the shuttered window where Silas stood. Bullets chewed away the edges of the wood, sending jagged splinters flying across the room. One splinter as thick as a finger grazed Silas's cheek, leaving a bright red line of blood. He didn't even flinch. He dropped to one knee, changing his angle, and fired twice more through a lower slit. Another shout of pain echoed from the yard. "That's 2 down," Silas muttered, his voice eerily calm as he shoved fresh cartridges into the rifle's loading gate. "They're losing their nerve. They expected a farmer, not a fight." "Are you hit?" Clara called out, her medical training trying to pierce her panic. She saw the blood on his cheek. "Just a scratch, Doc. Stay down." The gunfire outside sputtered and died down to intermittent, cautious shots. The attackers had realized that a direct assault on a fortified cabin manned by a deadshot was suicide. "Jessup!" a voice yelled from a distance. "He's too well covered. We can't push the door without losing 2 more men." A tense silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded man outside and the restless stamping of the horses. The sun had fully set now, plunging the cabin into thick, suffocating darkness. Clara peeked around the edge of the stove. She could barely make out Silas's silhouette by the window. "What are they doing?" she whispered. "Thinking," Silas said grimly, "which is dangerous for men like that." Suddenly, a flickering orange glow bloomed outside the window slits. It wasn't the steady light of a lantern, it was wild, dancing, and growing rapidly. The smell of burning sagebrush and dry grass wafted into the cabin, acrid and choking. "Fire!" Clara breathed, horror turning her blood to ice. "They're trying to burn us out." "No," Silas said, stepping back from the window, his voice losing its calm for the first time. "They're not trying to burn the cabin. The logs are too thick, it'd take hours." He rushed to the back window of the cabin, the one facing the canyon and the corral. He threw open the heavy wooden shutter. Clara gasped. The canyon behind the cabin was illuminated in a hellish, demonic glow. Thorne's men hadn't set fire to the house. They had set fire to the dry brush at the mouth of the narrow canyon pass, the only exit from the oasis, the very place Silas kept his corralled mustangs. Because of the severe drought, the brush was like tinder. The fire roared to life instantly, a wall of flame leaping 10 feet into the air, driven by the evening thermal winds directly toward the corral. The panicked screams of the trapped horses echoed over the crackle of the flames. It was a horrific, desperate sound that tore at Clara's heart. "They're burning the horses," Silas whispered, his face illuminated by the orange glow, contorted in a mask of absolute paralyzing horror. This wasn't just a tactic to smoke him out. This was an attack on his soul. Those mustangs were his penance, his life's work. Thorne's men knew that if Silas stayed in the cabin, the horses would burn alive. If he went out to save them, he would be silhouetted against the flames, an easy target for Jessup's rifles. It was a sadistic, perfect trap. Silas dropped the Winchester. He turned toward the table, his hands shaking, and grabbed his 2 Colt revolvers. He checked the cylinders with frantic, jerky movements. The cold professional was gone. The desperate man had taken over. "Silas, no!" Clara screamed, scrambling out from behind the stove. She ran to him, grabbing his arm. "It's a trap. If you go out there, they'll gun you down in seconds." "I can't let them burn," Silas roared, his gray eyes wild, reflecting the firelight. He tried to pull his arm away, but Clara held on with both hands, using all her strength. "You will die," she yelled over the roar of the fire. "And then I will die, and the horses will burn anyway." Silas stopped pulling. He looked down at her, his chest heaving, torn between the instinct to protect his animals and the cold logic she was forcing upon him. "You're a doctor," he growled, his voice breaking. "You save lives. Tell me how to save them without dying." Clara looked at the flames roaring toward the corral. She looked at the heavy horse blankets stacked in the corner of the cabin. Her brilliant, analytical mind, trained to find solutions in the chaos of an operating room, raced. "Water," she said rapidly. "The spring. The blankets. We soak the heavy woolen blankets in the spring. We cover ourselves. We don't run toward the men. We run toward the corral, open the gate, and drive the horses through the weakest part of the fire line, up the rocky incline where the brush is thin. The wet wool will protect us from the worst of the heat for 60 seconds. Silas stared at her. It was a desperate, insane plan. It required running directly toward a wildfire, while men with rifles waited to shoot them. "Jessup's men," Silas started. "They will be blinded by the fire themselves," Clara interrupted, her blue eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering determination. "They are expecting a man with a gun. They are not expecting 2 people wearing wet blankets driving a herd of panicked mustangs straight at them. It will be chaos. We use the chaos." She didn't wait for his approval. She ran to the corner, grabbed 2 heavy, thick woolen horse blankets, and dragged them toward the back door that led to the spring. "Are you with me, cowboy?" Clara shouted, throwing one of the heavy blankets at his chest. Silas caught the blanket. He looked at the disgraced lady doctor from Cheyenne standing in the middle of a war zone, ready to run into a literal firestorm to save a herd of wild horses she had never met. He had staked his life on worse odds, but he had never staked it on a braver partner. Silas holstered one Colt, keeping the other in his right hand. He threw the blanket over his left shoulder. "Let's go to work, Doc," he said. He threw open the back door, and together they plunged into the searing, orange nightmare of the Wyoming Badlands. The spring behind the cabin was a black mirror under the night sky. its icy depths untouched by the inferno raging just 50 yards away. Silas and Clara hit the water's edge at a sprint. "In!" Clara ordered, her voice cutting through the roar of the approaching fire. "Submerge them completely!" Silas plunged the heavy woolen horse blankets into the dark water. They drank greedily, tripling in weight within seconds, transforming from rough fabric into heavy, dripping armor. The ambient air temperature was rising exponentially, turning the night into a suffocating furnace. Embers the size of silver dollars drifted through the smoke like angry glowing insects, hissing as they landed in the spring. Clara dragged her blanket out, her shoulders straining against the sudden massive weight. She draped it over her head and shoulders, forming a crude cowl that shadowed her face. "Stay close to my back," Silas yelled over the din, throwing his own soaked blanket over his head, holding it closed at his throat with his left hand while his right gripped the heavy Colt .44. "If we get separated in the smoke, drop to the ground and crawl back to the water. Do not look for me. Do you hear me, Clara?" It was the first time he had used her given name. It hung in the blistering air for a fraction of a second, an anchor of humanity in the midst of hell. "Lead the way, Silas," she replied, her eyes wide but terrifyingly resolute beneath the dripping wool. They ran. Leaving the relative safety of the spring and plunging toward the corral was like stepping into the open mouth of a blast furnace. The heat didn't just burn, it consumed. It sucked the oxygen from the air, replacing it with searing toxic smoke that tasted of ash and resin. The wet wool instantly began to steam, wrapping Clara in a cocoon of scalding vapor, but it kept the immediate flames from blistering her skin. Through the stinging haze, the corral materialized. The Mustangs were in a state of absolute primal hysteria. They were hurling their massive bodies against the thick wooden railings, screaming in a pitch that made the hair on Silas's arms stand on end. The black stallion was rearing in the center, his eyes rolling white, his hooves striking out at the encroaching wall of fire that was rapidly consuming the dry brush along the canyon walls. "Open the gate!" Clara shouted, pushing past Silas to reach the heavy iron latch. "I'll guide them out, you make the noise." Silas didn't argue. He knew horses, and he knew they needed a terrifying push to run toward the heat to find the safe path up the scree slope. As Clara threw her weight against the heavy wooden gate, swinging it outward, Silas stepped into the opening. He didn't fire his gun. Gunfire was what had spooked them in the first place, but he raised his arms, the wet blanket expanding like a pair of massive dark wings, and let out a roar that tore from the deepest, most scarred part of his chest. It was a feral, terrifying sound, born of years of violence and survival. The black stallion locked eyes with him for a split second. Then, driven by the sheer dominant force of Silas's presence and the opening Clara had created, the stallion bolted. He surged forward, 1,000 pounds of panicked muscle, and the rest of the herd followed. They poured out of the corral like a dark, thunderous river. The ground shook violently beneath Clara's feet. She pressed her back against the gatepost, pulling the wet blanket tight, feeling the wind of their passing, the heat radiating from their sweat-lathered coats. The herd didn't run aimlessly. Guided by the narrow confines of the canyon and the stallion's desperate instinct, they charged straight through the weakest section of the fire line, the very spot where Jessup and his men were undoubtedly waiting to shoot whoever emerged from the cabin. Through the smoke, Silas heard the shouts of Thorne's men shift from predatory arrogance to sudden, overwhelming terror. "Horses, look out! Shoot 'em! Shoot 'em!" A few wild, panicked shots rang out, but they were swallowed by the thunder of 30 sets of hooves. A man screamed as he was trampled, the sound sickeningly abrupt. The ambush was shattered, the attackers scattered and blinded by dust, smoke, and a stampede of wild mustangs. "Now!" Silas grabbed Clara's arm. "Up the slope." They abandoned the path of the horses and cut sharply to the right, aiming for the steep, rocky incline of the canyon wall where the brush was too sparse to hold the fire. The climb was brutal. The loose shale slid beneath their boots, threatening to send them tumbling back into the inferno. Clara's lungs burned, begging for clean air, her legs screaming in protest against the steep grade and the oppressive weight of the steaming blanket. Halfway up, the smoke grew so thick it blinded them. Silas was navigating by memory and touch, pulling Clara upward by her hand. Suddenly, a figure loomed out of the gray haze above them. It was one of Jessup's men, a kid no older than 20, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wide with panic. He had scrambled up the slope to avoid the horses and had stumbled right into their path. He was coughing violently, but as he saw Silas, his hand dropped toward the revolver on his hip. Silas was faster. He was always faster. In a blur of motion, Silas dropped his wet blanket. His Colt leveled at the kid's chest. The hammer cocked back with a sharp, fatal click. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Silas looked into the terrified eyes of the boy. The Pinkerton instinct, the cold, dead thing inside him that had kept him alive for a decade, roared to the surface. Threat, eliminate, survive. His finger tightened on the trigger. It would be so easy. It was what he was built for. Silas! Clara's voice wasn't a scream. It was a sharp, commanding strike. She dropped her own blanket and stepped forward, placing herself directly in the line of fire, her small hand clamping down over the cylinder of Silas's revolver. The hot metal seared her palm, but she didn't flinch. Silas stared at her, his pale gray eyes dark and dilated, a killer caught in the act. "Look at him," Clara said, her voice steady, forcing Silas to break eye contact with her and look at the boy. The kid was trembling violently, his hands raised, his gun still holstered. He had wet himself in terror. "He's a child playing a man's game," Clara continued, her grip on the gun unyielding. "If you pull that trigger, you are exactly the monster the world believes you to be. You are the killer Thaddeus Thorne hired you to mirror. Do not give them your soul, Silas. Not for him." Silas breathed heavily, the adrenaline demanding blood, the fire roaring below them. He looked at the trembling boy, then down at the small, fierce woman holding his weapon. She was covered in ash, her dress torn, her face blistered by the heat. But she possessed a moral authority that dwarfed the mountains around them. She believed in his humanity when he had long ceased to believe in it himself. Slowly, agonizingly, Silas eased his finger off the trigger. He uncocked the hammer and lowered the gun. He stepped up to the boy, who flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, Silas reached out, grabbed the kid's revolver from its holster, and threw it far into the burning canyon below. "Climb," Silas growled at the boy, pointing toward the ridge. "If I see your face in Wyoming again, I won't have a doctor here to save your life. Run!" The boy scrambled up the scree like a frightened animal, disappearing into the smoke. Silas turned back to Clara. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold, hollow ache in its wake. That was a foolish thing to do, stepping in front of a loaded gun. "It was a necessary thing," Clara said, reaching out to gently touch the unburnt side of his face. "You saved my life in the desert. I just saved yours on this mountain." They didn't have time to say more. The fire was climbing the lower brush, the heat pushing them upward. Together, leaning on each other, they crested the ridge of the canyon. They collapsed onto the flat, hard-packed earth of the plateau, gasping for the relatively clean, cool air of the high ground. Below them, the canyon was a cauldron of fire. The cabin, built of thick green logs, was still standing, an island in the inferno, and the Mustangs were safely scattered on the plains to the north. They had survived. Silas lay on his back, staring up at the smoke-obscured stars. He felt Clara shift beside him. She sat up, wincing, and pulled her medical bag onto her lap. Even here, in the aftermath of near death, her hands were steady as she took out a tin of burn salve. "Sit up, cowboy," she said, her voice soft but brokering no argument. "You have a blister on your neck that needs attention." Silas sat up. He let her apply the cool, soothing ointment to his burns. He watched her face, illuminated by the distant glow of the fire below. The fierce, untouchable Pinkerton agent was gone. In his place was a man who had staked his life on a woman's desperate plan, and won. "You're a remarkable woman, Clara Bowden," Silas said quietly. Clara paused, her fingers lingering against his skin for a heartbeat longer than medically necessary. "And you are a better man than you let the world see, Silas Vance." Suddenly the wind shifted. It was a violent, sudden gust coming off the northern plains. It hit the canyon like a bellows, whipping the flames into a frenzy. Silas stood up, narrowing his eyes against the ash. He watched the trajectory of the fire change. It was no longer burning aimlessly. It was racing down the eastern throat of the canyon. "The wind caught it," Silas said, a grim realization settling over him. "Where is it heading?" Clara asked, coming to stand beside him. Silas pointed toward a faint cluster of lights about 2 miles down the gorge. "Straight for the silver mine. Straight for Thaddeus Thorne's camp." The fire they had set to destroy Silas was now a tidal wave of destruction, and it was heading right for their own front door. The mining camp was not built to withstand a siege of nature. It was a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents, wooden sluices, and hastily erected timber structures huddled around the maw of the silver mine. From their vantage point on the ridge, Silas and Clara watched the disaster unfold. The wildfire, supercharged by the sudden wind shift in the dry timber of the canyon, hit the camp like a physical blow. Tents went up in instantaneous sheets of flame. Men scattered like ants, their shouts carrying faintly on the wind, a discordant chorus of panic. "We should go back to the springs," Silas said, his voice flat. "The fire is moving away from the cabin. We're safe now. Let Thorne reap what he sowed." It was the pragmatic choice, the survivor's choice. Thorne had tried to murder them less than an hour ago. Let the fire claim the debt. Clara looked at the burning camp, her hands gripping the handles of her medical bag so tightly her knuckles were white. The orange glow reflected in her eyes, warring with the cool clinical blue. "There are 50 men down there," Clara said softly. "Miners, laborers. Most of them had nothing to do with Jessup or Thorne's vendetta against you. They are just poor men trying to scratch a living from the dirt. They work for him. They bleed the same color," Clara countered, turning to face him. The defiance was back, stronger than ever. "I took an oath, Silas. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm, but to stand by and watch men burn when I have the skills to help. That is doing harm. That is a sin of omission." Silas looked at her. He saw the absolute, unyielding morality that had gotten her run out of Cheyenne. She was a woman who would walk into hell for a stranger, even a hostile one, because her calling demanded it. It was a terrifying, beautiful flaw. "It's a suicide mission, Clara," he warned. "Thorne is down there. If he sees us, he might shoot us just out of spite." "Then you will have to make sure he doesn't," Clara said, stepping closer to him, looking up into his scarred face. "I am going down there, Silas. I'm going to do my job. Will you do yours?" He had spent his life protecting wealthy men, corrupt men, men who paid in gold for his gun. Now a disgraced, penniless female doctor was asking him to protect her while she saved his enemies. Silas racked the lever of his Winchester, a harsh, metallic promise in the night. "Walk behind me," he said. They descended the ridge via a switchback trail, the heat intensifying as they neared the camp. The scene was apocalyptic. The main processing building was a roaring bonfire. Men were forming desperate bucket lines from a muddy creek, their efforts pitiful against the wall of flame. As they stepped into the outer ring of the camp, a miner covered in soot spotted them. He raised a pickaxe, recognizing Silas. "Vance!" the miner yelled. "You brought this on us!" Silas leveled the Winchester at the man's chest, not breaking stride. "The fire started at my end of the canyon, friend. You ask Thorne who struck the match. Now drop the pick and point us to the wounded, or I'll put you on the ground." The miner looked at Silas's eyes, dropped the pickaxe, and pointed toward a large, slightly intact mess tent set back from the flames. They moved through the chaos, an island of lethal calm and medical purpose. When they reached the mess tent, they found it converted into a makeshift, nightmarish triage center. Men were groaning on tables, suffering from severe burns, smoke inhalation, and broken bones from collapsing timbers. And in the center of it all, kneeling in the dirt, was Thaddeus Thorne. Thorne was a heavy-set man, usually immaculate in his tailored suits, but now he was covered in mud and blood. He was weeping openly, his hands frantically pressing a soiled shirt against the leg of a young man, his son, Thomas. A heavy support beam from the collapsing sluice had fallen on the boy. His right leg below the knee was a mangled, pulped ruin of bone and muscle. The bleeding was catastrophic. A camp cook was helplessly trying to tie a rope around the thigh as a tourniquet, but he was doing it wrong. The boy was gray, slipping rapidly into shock. "He's dying!" Thorne screamed at the men around him. "Someone help him! I'll pay $10,000 to the man who saves him!" The men looked away. They were miners, not surgeons. "Money cannot buy blood, Mr. Thorne." A clear, feminine voice rang out over the moans of the injured. Thorne's head snapped up. He saw Silas Vance standing in the entrance of the tent, looking like the angel of death himself, the Winchester resting casually against his hip. But Silas wasn't the one who had spoken. Clara stepped out from behind Silas, her medical bag in hand. She walked directly toward Thorne, the surrounding men parting for her out of sheer confusion. "You," Thorne gasped, recognizing her from the descriptions his men had given of the woman at Vance's cabin. "You're the woman. What are you doing here?" "Vance, if you've come to finish me—" "Shut up and move," Clara commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the absolute authority of a physician in her domain. Thorne, stunned by her tone, scrambled backward. Clara dropped to her knees beside the boy. She didn't look at the gore with disgust. She looked at it as a mechanical failure that needed immediate intervention. She shoved the incompetent cook aside, ripped the useless rope away, and dug into her bag. "Silas," she said sharply. Silas stepped forward, his eyes scanning the tent, his rifle ready. "Here. I need light, and I need this tourniquet applied exactly where I tell you. Pull it until the bleeding stops and not a fraction tighter." She handed him a thick leather strap with a brass buckle. Silas slung his rifle over his back, drew a Colt, and held it in his left hand while his right took the strap. He knelt opposite her. He placed the strap high on the boy's thigh, exactly where her blood-slicked finger pointed, and pulled. His immense strength locked the leather in place. The arterial spurting immediately slowed to a sluggish seep. "Good," Clara said. She looked at the mangled bone. "The limb is unsalvageable. The crush injury has destroyed the vascular system. If I don't amputate immediately, the necrosis will kill him by morning, if blood loss doesn't claim him in the next 10 minutes. "Amputate?" Thorne choked out, crawling forward. "No, he's my heir. He can't be a cripple. You're a woman. You don't know what you're doing." Silas stood up. He didn't point the gun at Thorne, but he placed his large, scarred hand flat against the tycoon's chest, stopping him dead. "That woman," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register, "is the only thing standing between your son and a pine box. You will step back, you will keep your mouth shut, and you will pray to whatever God you believe in that her hands are steady." Thorne looked into Silas's eyes, saw the unwavering lethal promise there, and crumpled. He fell to his knees in the dirt, burying his face in his hands. Clara ignored them both. She was already in her element. "Ether," she said, pulling a glass bottle and a cloth cone from her bag. She placed it over the boy's nose and mouth, waiting for his agonized thrashing to subside into deep, chemically induced sleep. Once he was under, she moved with blinding speed. It was a brutal, bloody, horrific piece of carpentry, but it was executed with the grace of an artist. She used her scalpel to cut clean flaps of skin and muscle, bypassing the crushed tissue. She took a surgical saw and sheared through the femur with smooth, forceful strokes. The miners in the tent, hardened men who spent their lives breaking rock, turned away, pale and nauseated. Silas did not turn away. He watched her. He watched the sweat bead on her forehead, the fierce concentration in her blue eyes, the blood staining her hands up to the wrists. He had seen men kill with cold precision, but he had never seen anyone save a life with such magnificent, terrifying competence. She was a warrior, fighting a war against death itself. She clamped the arteries, tying them off with catgut. She folded the muscle flaps over the bone, stitching the skin closed with rapid, flawless sutures. "Release the tourniquet slowly," she instructed Silas, not looking up. Silas eased the buckle. Clara watched the stump intently. No spurting, the ties held. She slumped back on her heels, blowing a stray lock of hair out of her eyes. "He will live," she announced to the silent tent. "Keep him warm. Watch for infection. I will leave instructions for dressing the wound." A profound, stunned silence filled the mess tent, save for the crackle of the fire outside. Thaddeus Thorne crawled forward. He looked at his son's chest, rising and falling steadily in deep sleep. He looked at the neatly bandaged stump. Then he looked up at Clara Bowden. The arrogance, the wealth, the petty cruelty were gone from the tycoon's face. He was just a terrified father looking at his son's savior. "Why?" Thorne rasped, his voice trembling. "I sent men to kill you. I burned your canyon. Why did you save my boy?" Clara stood up, wiping her bloody hands on a towel. She looked down at the wealthy man kneeling in the dirt. "Because I am a physician, Mr. Thorne," Clara said with quiet dignity. "And unlike you, I do not believe that the value of a life is determined by who owns the water." She picked up her medical bag. Silas stepped beside her, his large frame a silent, impenetrable shield. "Vance," Thorne said, looking at the former Pinkerton. "The springs, the land, it's yours. I'll sign the deed over tomorrow. I'll pay for the damages. Just thank you." Silas didn't smile. He just tipped the brim of his Stetson. "See that you do, Thorne. And if I hear anyone in this territory speak a word of disrespect against Dr. Bowden, I'll consider it a personal insult. You know how I handle insults." "They won't," Thorne whispered. "I swear it." Silas placed a gentle hand on the small of Clara's back. "Let's go home, Doc." They walked out of the tent, out of the burning camp, and back toward the dark, quiet sanctuary of the canyon. The fire was dying down, starved of fuel, leaving behind a scarred but surviving landscape. As they walked, Clara leaned into Silas's side. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her exhausted. Silas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, supporting her weight. "You staked your life on me back there," Clara murmured, looking up at the stars. "If Thorne had ordered his men to shoot, you would have died protecting me." "I told you," Silas said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I was betting you had a heart tough enough to survive. Turns out your heart was big enough to save us all." He stopped walking. He looked down at her, his scarred face softening in the moonlight. Gently, reverently, he leaned down and kissed her. It tasted of smoke and sweat, and the sudden, overwhelming promise of tomorrow. Epilogue. 3 years later. The Wyoming Badlands were unforgiving, but they were not invincible. The drought had broken 2 years ago, bringing a monsoon season that had reshaped the earth. The spring behind the cabin was no longer just a pool. It had swelled into a thriving, lush oasis. Cottonwood trees provided deep, cool shade, and the canyon floor was a carpet of resilient green grass. Silas Vance stood by the newly rebuilt, expanded corral, leaning on the top rail. He was watching a young, spirited Mustang colt testing its legs. Silas's face still bore the scars of his past, but the cold, dead look in his gray eyes had vanished, replaced by a deep, anchoring peace. The sound of a ringing bell carried on the warm afternoon breeze. Silas turned. A few hundred yards away, built near the entrance of the canyon where it was accessible to the main road, stood a sturdy 2-story timber building. The sign above the door read in bold, uncompromising letters, "Clara Vance, M.D. M's. Clinic and Surgery." The ringing bell meant the afternoon rounds were over. Silas pushed off the fence and walked toward the clinic. As he approached, the front door opened. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She was wiping her hands on an apron, her face flushed but smiling. She was no longer the tattered, desperate woman he had found in the dust. She was a pillar of the territory. Miners, ranchers, and even outlaws rode for days to seek the healing hands of the woman who had faced down Thaddeus Thorne. Clara looked up and saw Silas approaching. Her smile widened, illuminating her face. But Silas wasn't just looking at his wife. He was looking at the bundle she carried in her left arm. He climbed the porch steps and reached out, his massive, calloused hands gently taking the sleeping infant from her. The baby girl, 6 months old, had a shock of dark hair, and when she opened them, eyes the color of a Wyoming storm. "She slept through the entire shoulder dislocation I just set," Clara laughed softly, leaning her head against Silas's arm. "She has your nerves, cowboy." "And your stubbornness," Silas replied, kissing the top of his daughter's head, then leaning over to kiss his wife. He looked out over the canyon, at the green oasis, the strong horses, and the woman who had walked into the fire to save a stranger. He had spent his life believing he was a weapon, a tool for violence, destined to die alone in the dirt. Nobody had believed in Clara Bowden, until a broken cowboy had staked his life on her heart. And in doing so, she had given him a heart of his own. The Badlands were still a harsh place. But standing there, holding his daughter and his wife, Silas Vance knew they had built a sanctuary that not even the fires of hell could burn down. Dawn in the Wyoming Badlands usually arrived like the opening of a furnace door. But the morning following the Great Canyon fire broke with an eerie, muted stillness. A thick blanket of gray clouds had rolled in over the mountains during the night, trapping the scent of wet ash and charred sagebrush close to the earth. Silas Vance woke to the unfamiliar sensation of profound, heavy peace. For the past 10 years, his mornings had begun with the sharp jolt of survival instinct, a hand instinctively reaching for the Colt beneath his pillow, ears straining for the sound of approaching boots. But today, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic breathing of the woman sleeping beside him. Clara lay curled on her side in the narrow cot, her face turned toward him. In the pale, filtered morning light, the toll of the previous night was starkly visible. Her skin was smeared with soot that even their brief wash at the spring hadn't entirely removed. An angry red blister marked her jawline where a stray ember had kissed her skin. And her hands, the miraculous, steady hands that had saved Thaddeus Thorne's son, were wrapped in loose, white bandages to protect her own minor burns. She looked battered, exhausted, and utterly beautiful. Silas lay perfectly still, not wanting to wake her. He watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, a quiet marveling taking root in his scarred soul. He had lived his life as a ghost, haunting the frontier, a man who dealt exclusively in ledgers of blood and gunpowder. Yet here, in the ashes of what was supposed to be his tomb, he had found something to anchor him to the world of the living. "I was betting you had a heart tough enough to survive," he had told her. He hadn't realized he was betting his own heart in the process. Slowly, carefully, Silas slipped out of the bed. His muscles screamed in protest, a chorus of aches from the brutal climb up the scree slope and the tense standoff at the mining camp. He dressed quietly, pulling on a clean linen shirt and his denim trousers, strapping his gun belt around his waist out of pure muscle memory rather than imminent fear. He stepped out the heavy front door and took a deep breath. The canyon was a landscape of stark contrasts. To the east, the brush and timber were reduced to black, smoking skeletons, painting a grim streak of devastation all the way to the silver mine. But immediately surrounding the cabin, the oasis remained untouched. The spring still bubbled clear and cold, and the thick cottonwoods stood sentinel, their green leaves dusted with gray ash but stubbornly alive. Silas walked to the corral. The gate swung open, exactly as Clara had pushed it the night before. He looked out across the western plains. There, grazing nervously but safely in the distance, was his herd of mustangs. The black stallion stood at the edge of the herd, his head raised, watching Silas. Silas let out a long, shuddering breath. The horses were safe. The cabin was safe. Clara was safe. "You're up early." Silas turned. Clara stood in the doorway, wrapped in one of his oversized woolen blankets against the morning chill. Her hair was loose, falling in a messy, dark cascade over her shoulders. She looked at the blackened canyon, her blue eyes taking in the scale of the destruction they had narrowly escaped. "Couldn't sleep," Silas said, walking back toward the porch. "Figured I should count my blessings before they decided to wander off." Clara offered a small, tired smile. "Are the horses all right?" "Spooked, but whole. They'll drift back to the spring by nightfall once they realize the fire is dead." He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her. "How are your hands?" Clara lifted her bandaged fingers, inspecting them with clinical detachment. "First-degree burns, mostly. Nothing that will permanently impair motor function. I'll be able to hold a scalpel again in a few days, though I suspect pouring coffee this morning might be a challenge." Silas walked up the steps and gently took her bandaged hands in his own, mindful of the pressure. He didn't say anything, but the way his thumbs lightly stroked the edge of her bandages spoke volumes. It was an apology for bringing the danger to her doorstep, and a profound gratitude that she had faced it with him. "I can pour the coffee," Silas murmured. They moved inside. As Silas worked the stove, boiling water for the coffee and frying up thick slices of cured bacon, a comfortable domestic silence settled over the cabin. It was a stark contrast to the terror of the night before. They had just sat down at the heavy oak table, the steam from the tin cups curling into the air, when the sound of an approaching horse broke the quiet. Silas's demeanor changed instantly. The domestic peace vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating posture of the Pinkerton. He stood up, his hand dropping to his coat, and moved to the window slit. "Who is it?" Clara asked, setting her cup down, her own heart rate spiking. "One rider," Silas reported, his eyes narrowed. "Not Jessup. Looks like a city man, wearing a bowler hat and a suit that cost more than this cabin." Silas opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch, leaving Clara safely inside, but close to the frame. The rider pulled up his exhausted, sweat-lathered horse. He was a nervous-looking man with spectacles and a leather briefcase clutched tightly under his arm. He looked at Silas, taking in the scars, the gun, and the uncompromising stare, and swallowed hard. "Mr. Silas Vance?" the man asked, his voice trembling slightly. "State your business," Silas rumbled. "My name is Abernathy. I am Thaddeus Thorne's legal counsel." The man practically scrambled off his horse, holding his hands up to show they were empty before reaching into his briefcase. "Mr. Thorne sent me at first light. He instructed me not to return until I had delivered these to you personally." Abernathy pulled a thick manila envelope from the case and held it out as if offering meat to a chained wolf. Silas didn't step off the porch. "Bring it here." The lawyer hurried forward, handed the envelope to Silas, and immediately took 3 steps back. "Mr. Thorne wishes to express his profound gratitude to the physician," Abernathy stammered, glancing nervously at the dark doorway of the cabin. "His son, Thomas, survived the night. The fever is low, the bleeding has stopped. The camp cook said it was a miracle. Mr. Thorne says it was the doctor." Clara stepped out of the shadows, coming to stand beside Silas. The lawyer's eyes widened as he took in her soot-stained clothes and bandaged hands. "It wasn't a miracle, Mr. Abernathy," Clara said crisply. "It was medical science and basic hygiene. Tell Mr. Thorne to ensure the bandages are boiled before they are changed and to keep the boy hydrated." "I will, ma'am. I absolutely will." Abernathy nodded vigorously. He pointed to the envelope in Silas's hand. "Inside, you will find the deed to this canyon, the spring, and the surrounding 500 acres, transferred free and clear into your name, Mr. Vance. Furthermore, there is a bank draft drawn on the First National Bank of Cheyenne for $5,000. Mr. Thorne calls it restitution for damages rendered to your property and peace of mind." Silas looked at the envelope. $5,000 was a fortune. It was enough money to buy a massive ranch in California, or a fleet of ships back east. It was Thorne's way of buying his conscience clean and buying Silas's mercy. "Thorne understands that this ends the dispute?" Silas asked, his voice flat. "He doesn't look my way. He doesn't breathe my air, and his men stay on their side of the ridge." "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. He swore it on his son's life." Abernathy touched the brim of his bowler hat. "If there is nothing else, I will take my leave." "Tell Thorne the debt is settled," Silas said. Abernathy didn't need to be told twice. He mounted his horse and rode back toward the blackened trail as if the devil himself were chasing him. Silas stood on the porch, looking at the envelope. He opened it, pulling out the heavy, embossed deed and the crisp bank draft. He handed them to Clara. "Looks like we own a canyon," Silas said quietly. Clara looked at the papers, her thumb tracing the ink. $5,000. With that kind of money, she could go to San Francisco. She could buy a proper house, establish a pristine practice in a civilized city that might be more forgiving of a female physician. She had the means to leave the dust and the danger behind forever. She looked up from the papers, out at the rugged, harsh beauty of the Badlands, and then up at the scarred, beautiful face of the man beside her. "No," Clara said softly. "We own an oasis." Silas frowned slightly, misreading her tone. "If you want to go back east, Clara, or to the coast, this money is yours. You earned it last night. You saved that boy. You can go anywhere you want." Clara stepped closer, invading his space, forcing him to look down into her eyes. "Silas Vance, are you trying to get rid of me?" "I'm trying to give you the world you deserve," he said, the raw honesty in his voice making her breath catch. "This place, it's harsh. It's violent. You're a healer. You belong in a hospital with clean floors and electric lights, not in a dirt floor cabin with a man who has too many ghosts." Clara smiled, a fiercely tender expression that reached all the way to her eyes. She reached up, resting her bandaged hands flat against his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart. "I have seen the civilized world, Silas. They burned my clinic because I wouldn't let a man die. Civilization is just savagery with better table manners." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I don't want clean floors. I want a place where I can do my work without asking permission from men who have never held a scalpel. And I want to do it with you." Silas wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tightly against him, burying his face in her hair. The last lingering knot of tension in his chest finally unspooled. "What do you want to do with the money, Doc?" he asked, his voice muffled against her. Clara pulled back just enough to look at the empty expanse of flat land near the mouth of the canyon, where the road from the mining camp met the main trail to town. "I want lumber," Clara said, her analytical mind already drawing blueprints in the air. "I want glass windows. I want proper surgical steel from back east. We are going to build a clinic, Silas, right here at the edge of the springs. The miners get hurt constantly. The ranchers need a doctor. If we build it, they will come." Silas looked at the empty dirt, then at the blazing determination in her eyes. He had spent his life tearing things down, breaking men and horses. The idea of building something that fostered life instead of ending it, was terrifying and intoxicating. "A clinic in the Badlands," Silas mused, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. "They'll say you're crazy." "Let them," Clara replied, turning to kiss him. "They said you were a monster, and they were wrong about that too." The transition from survival to sanctuary did not happen overnight. It was built with sweat, blistered hands, and the sheer, stubborn will of two people who refused to be broken by the world. By the time the brutal Wyoming winter began to thaw into a muddy, vibrant spring, the landscape of the canyon had fundamentally changed. The $5,000 from Thaddeus Thorne had purchased the finest lumber available in Cheyenne. Silas, working alongside a crew of carpenters he had hired at premium wages, had erected a 2-story timber building near the canyon's entrance. It boasted a wide, welcoming porch, a waiting room with a cast-iron stove, A sterilized operating theater with large glass windows to let in the natural light, and comfortable living quarters upstairs. The sign out front read, Clara Bowden, M.D., Surgery and Clinic, all welcome. Word had spread quickly. The miners from Thorne's camp, remembering the woman who had saved the boss's son, came first. Then came the local ranchers, the drifters, and the outcasts. Clara treated them all with the same uncompromising, brilliant care. She set bones, extracted teeth, delivered babies, and stitched knife wounds, asking for payment only when the patient could afford it. Silas had hung up his guns. Mostly. He still wore his Colt when he rode out to work the Mustangs, but he no longer wore it like a threat. He had become the clinic's silent guardian, its groundskeeper, and occasionally its nurse. The men of the territory learned very quickly that while Dr. Bowden was an angel of mercy, the scarred, quiet man who chopped wood behind her clinic was a sleeping dragon they did not wish to wake. It was late April, and the evening air was crisp and smelling of rain, when the ghost from Silas's past rode up to the porch. Clara was upstairs, exhausted after a grueling 4-hour surgery to repair a ranch hand's crushed pelvis. Silas was sitting on the porch steps, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, watching the sun sink below the jagged peaks. The rider emerged from the twilight gloom. He didn't ride like a patient, He rode with the stiff, hyper-vigilant posture of a man hunting. Silas didn't stand up, but his posture shifted. The relaxed rancher vanished, and the Pinkerton agent re-emerged, cold and calculating. He took a slow drag of his cigarette and waited. The rider pulled his horse to a halt. He was a tall man wearing a long duster coat heavily coated in trail dust. Beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes were sharp and predatory. He carried a sawn-off double-barreled shotgun resting casually across the pommel of his saddle. "Hello, Silas," the rider said. The voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely out of place in the Badlands. Silas flicked his cigarette into the dirt. "John Miller. It's been a long time. I heard you took a bullet in Denver." "Takes more than a stray bullet to put me in the ground," Miller replied, dismounting with a grimace that betrayed a lingering stiffness in his leg. He looked up at the clinic, reading the sign. "Word in Cheyenne is that Silas Vance, the meanest son of a bitch the agency ever employed, is playing housemaid to a disgraced lady doctor." I didn't believe it until I saw it. People change, John. You should try it. Silas remained seated, but his right hand rested loosely on his knee, inches from the holster he hadn't strapped on today. "I ain't here for a social call, Silas," Miller said, his tone turning businesslike. He tapped the stock of his shotgun. "I've been tracking a kid for 3 weeks. Name of Billy the Kid Harmon. Robbed a Union Pacific paymaster down in Laramie. Shot a guard doing it." Silas's face remained a mask of stone. And I caught up with him yesterday by the river. Put a bullet in his gut before he managed to slip away in the brush. He's bleeding, he's desperate. And the nearest sawbones who won't turn him into the law immediately is right here." Miller took a step toward the porch. "I know he's inside, Silas. I found his horse tied out back." Silas didn't deny it. 2 hours ago, a terrified 19-year-old boy had stumbled onto the porch, clutching his stomach, his hands slick with dark blood. Clara had taken one look at him and ordered Silas to carry him into the operating theater. She was up there now, trying to piece his intestines back together. "The boy's a patient," Silas said evenly. "He's under a doctor's care." "He's a murderer with a $500 bounty on his head, dead or alive," Miller countered, taking another step. "I prefer alive, for the bonus. But if he dies on the table, I'll take the body. Step aside, Silas. I'm going in to collect my property." Silas finally stood up. He wasn't wearing his gun belt, but his sheer physical presence seemed to block the entire entrance to the clinic. "No, you're not," Silas said. Miller stopped, his eyes narrowing. He shifted the shotgun slightly, the barrels pointing toward the porch floor. "Are you really going to stand between an agent of the law and a fugitive? You, the man who shot 3 men in a saloon over a stolen horse in Abilene?" You're a killer, Silas. Don't play the saint with me. I was a killer, Silas corrected quietly. Because I didn't know how to be anything else. But I don't hunt men anymore, John. I guard a healer. This building is a sanctuary. Nobody crosses that threshold with a weapon, and nobody leaves it until the doctor says they're fit. He's a criminal, Miller barked, losing his cultured veneer. He shot a man, and he will face a judge for it when he can stand on his own 2 feet, Silas replied, his voice dropping to that lethal, terrifying register that Miller remembered all too well. But tonight, he is a patient. If you try to walk through that door, John, you will not walk back out. The tension on the porch was thick enough to cut with a knife. Miller stared at Silas, weighing the odds. Miller had a shotgun and Silas was unarmed. But Miller knew Silas Vance. He knew that if he raised that weapon, Silas would close the distance before he could pull the trigger, and he would tear Miller apart with his bare hands. "Is there a problem out here?" The clear, sharp voice cut through the heavy air like a scalpel. Both men looked up. Clara stood in the doorway. She was wearing a blood-stained surgical apron, her sleeves rolled up, her face pale with exhaustion. She held a blood-soaked rag in her hands. Miller looked at her, his lip curling in a sneer. "You the doctor?" "I am Dr. Bowden," Clara said, stepping out onto the porch, standing shoulder to shoulder with Silas. She did not flinch at the sight of the shotgun. "And you are disturbing my patient's recovery. Your patient is a wanted man, lady. I'm here to take him." "My patient," Clara said coldly, "has a perforated bowel, severe peritonitis, and is currently running a fever of 104 degrees. If you move him, the sutures will tear, sepsis will spread rapidly, and he will die in agonizing pain within the hour." Miller shrugged. "Bounty says dead or alive. I get paid either way." Clara's eyes flashed with a fury that made even Silas mentally take a step back. She descended 1 step from the porch, closing the distance to the bounty hunter. "Listen to me very carefully, you pathetic excuse for a man," Clara hissed, her voice vibrating with absolute moral authority. "I did not spend 4 hours pulling lead out of a child's stomach so you could drag him behind a horse like a sack of meat. This clinic operates under the Hippocratic Oath. That boy stays in my bed until I say he is stable. If you want him before then, you will have to shoot me." Miller blinked, utterly derailed by the fierce, tiny woman in the bloody apron. He looked at Clara, then looked at Silas. Silas wasn't posturing, he was simply waiting for Miller to make a move so he could end him. The bounty hunter was trapped between a force of nature and a wall of stone. "He's going to hang anyway, Doc," Miller tried one last time, though the conviction had bled out of his voice. "That is a matter for the courts," Clara stated. "My matter is preserving his life long enough for him to face them. You can wait in town, Mr. Miller. The sheriff will notify you when the boy is discharged into his custody. But you will not set foot on this property again." Miller stared at them for a long, humiliating moment. He was a man who traded in violence and fear, and he had just been thoroughly defeated by a woman with no weapons and a man who refused to draw one. With a disgusted grunt, Miller broke open his shotgun, dramatically unloading the shells into his hand. He shoved them in his pocket and turned back to his horse. "You've gone soft, Vance," Miller spat as he mounted up. "This place, this woman, it's ruined you." "No, John," Silas said, watching the bounty hunter gather his reins. "It saved me." Miller spurred his horse and rode off into the darkening night, swallowed by the Badlands. Silas stood on the porch, listening to the hoofbeats fade. The adrenaline slowly drained from his system, leaving him feeling surprisingly light. He had faced down his past, and he had done it without spilling a drop of blood. He turned to Clara. She was trembling slightly now that the immediate threat was gone, the exhaustion of the surgery and the confrontation crashing down on her. Silas stepped forward and gently wrapped his arms around her, unmindful of the blood on her apron. He pulled her close, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "You are the most terrifying woman I have ever met," Silas murmured. Clara let out a shaky laugh, wrapping her arms around his waist. "He had a shotgun, Silas. You were standing there in your shirt sleeves." "I knew you'd come out and save me," he teased softly. Clara pulled back, looking up into his eyes. In the soft light spilling from the clinic window, she saw the profound truth in his face. He hadn't drawn a weapon because he had trusted her authority, her sanctuary, to be stronger than a gun. He had fully, finally, laid down the burden of his past. "The boy is sleeping," Clara said quietly. "He might not make it through the night. The infection is bad." "But he'll die in a clean bed with a doctor who fought for him," Silas said. "That's more than he would have had out there." "It's a start," Clara agreed. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "We did good today, cowboy." "We did," Silas said, looking out over the quiet, peaceful oasis they had built together. "Come on inside, Doc. Let's go home." They turned and walked back through the doors of the clinic, leaving the violence of the world outside, stepping together into the warm, unyielding light of the sanctuary they had forged in the dust. Billy, the Kid Harmon, did not hang. He did not face a judge, nor did he ride out of the Badlands to rob another Union Pacific train. He died on a Tuesday in late November, as the first hard frost of the Wyoming winter turned the canyon floor white and brittle. Despite Clara's relentless efforts, the peritonitis had ravaged the boy's body beyond the limits of 19th century medicine. But he did not die in a muddy ditch or at the end of a bounty hunter's rope. He died in a clean bed, free of pain, bathed in the scent of lavender and carbolic acid, holding Clara's hand while she read to him from a weathered book of poetry. Silas dug the grave. It took him 6 hours. The earth was already beginning to freeze, fighting the blade of his pickaxe with every strike. He worked stripped to his undershirt despite the biting cold, his breath pluming in white clouds, his scarred muscles bunching and releasing in a steady, punishing rhythm. He dug it deep under the largest cottonwood near the edge of the springs, a place where the wild mustangs often came to drink in the summer. When it was done, they buried the boy. Silas wrapped him in a clean canvas shroud, and Clara said a brief, quiet prayer over the mounded earth. She placed a small marker made of river stones at the head. "He was 19, Clara said softly, her breath catching in the freezing air. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. "A boy, driven to violence because he didn't know how else to survive the world." Silas stood beside her, his hands resting on the handle of the shovel. He looked at the grave and then out toward the endless snow-dusted plains. "The world is a hard place to learn better, Clara. It teaches you to shoot first or starve. You gave him a dignified end. That's more mercy than the territory ever showed him." Clara looked up at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion and the quiet, persistent grief that accompanied every life she couldn't save. "It doesn't feel like enough." Silas dropped the shovel. He stepped into her space, opening his heavy sheepskin coat, and wrapped it and his arms around her. He pulled her against his chest, shielding her from the biting northern wind. Clara leaned into him, resting her cheek against the rough flannel of his shirt, listening to the steady, reassuring drumbeat of his heart. "You can't save them all, Doc," Silas murmured into her hair. "You just fight the war one battle at a time. And today, you fought well." Winter descended on the Badlands with a ferocious, isolating finality. By December, the snowdrifts were chest-high in the canyon, turning the oasis into a white, silent fortress. The road to the mining camp and the trails to town were utterly impassable. The clinic, which had been a hub of chaotic activity for months, fell completely quiet. It was just the two of them, isolated from the rest of humanity by miles of lethal, freezing wilderness. For Silas, this kind of isolation was familiar. He had spent years wintering alone, conversing only with horses and his own dark thoughts. But this winter was fundamentally different. The cabin was no longer a tomb of memories. It was a home, warm and vibrant with Clara's presence. They settled into a quiet, intimate rhythm. The mornings were spent tending to survival. Silas breaking the ice over the spring, hauling water and carrying armfuls of split pine logs to feed the insatiable cast-iron stoves. Clara spent her time cataloging her medical supplies, studying her worn medical journals by the light of the oil lamp, and preparing meals from their carefully rationed stores of salted pork, dried beans, and flour. And it was during these quiet, snowbound weeks that the partnership forged in fire slowly transmuted into something profoundly deep and irrevocably romantic. They learned the geography of each other's souls without the distraction of impending violence. Silas learned that Clara hummed off-key when she was deep in thought. He learned that she hated the taste of chicory coffee, but drank it anyway without complaint. He learned the precise way her brow furrowed when she read a passage she disagreed with. And Clara learned Silas. She saw past the hardened exterior of the Pinkerton killer to the quiet, methodical caretaker beneath. She watched the gentle, almost reverent way he handled the Mustangs when he led them to the cleared waterhole. She noticed that he always positioned himself between her and the windows, a subconscious habit of a protector. And she felt the lingering, heavy heat of his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening in mid-January, the temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. The wind howled around the clinic, rattling the thick glass windows and threatening to tear the shingles from the roof. Inside the living quarters above the clinic, the large iron stove was roaring, casting a warm, flickering orange light across the room. Silas had spent the past hour hauling buckets of snow, melting them on the stove, and filling the large copper bathtub they had ordered from a catalog in the fall. It was a staggering luxury in the middle of a blizzard. "Water's ready," Silas announced, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He threw a large, clean towel over a chair near the stove to warm it. "You should soak. The cold is settling in your joints. I've seen how you're rubbing your hands." Clara looked up from her ledger, surprised and touched. She had been trying to hide the dull ache in her fingers, a lingering reminder of the burns she had suffered during the canyon fire. "Thank you, Silas," she said softly. "I'll go check the horses in the lower barn," he offered, reaching for his coat to give her privacy. "No." Silas paused, his hand hovering over the sheepskin collar. He turned to look at her. Clara closed the ledger. She stood up, the flickering firelight catching the dark, unbound cascade of her hair. Her blue eyes were startlingly clear, devoid of any hesitation. They had lived together for nearly a year. They had faced death, saved lives, and built a sanctuary. The artificial boundaries of propriety had burned away long ago. "The horses are fine," Clara said, her voice quiet but steady. "Stay, please." Silas let his hand fall to his side. He watched as she reached for the top button of her woolen dress. She unfastened it, and then the next, her movements deliberate and entirely unashamed. He didn't turn away. To look away would have been an insult to the profound trust she was offering him. He watched her shed the heavy layers of her clothing until she stepped into the steaming copper tub, letting out a long, shuddering sigh as the hot water enveloped her aching muscles. Silas walked over to the tub. He picked up the bar of lye soap and the sponge. "Lean forward," he said roughly, his voice thick with an emotion he was struggling to contain. Clara obeyed, resting her arms on the rolled edge of the copper tub. Silas knelt beside her. He dipped the sponge into the hot water, lathered it, and gently began to wash her back. His massive, calloused hands moved with astonishing tenderness. He traced the line of her spine, the delicate curve of her shoulders, washing away the metaphorical dirt of the long, hard months. Clara closed her eyes, melting into his touch, the heat of the water and the heat of his hands sending a heavy liquid warmth curling through her abdomen. "You carry too much weight on these shoulders, Doc," Silas murmured, his thumbs massaging the tight muscles at the base of her neck. "I have you to help me carry it," Clara whispered, leaning her head back, exposing the long, elegant column of her throat. Silas stopped washing. He looked down at her face, wet with steam, her eyes heavy and dark with a desire that mirrored his own. He dropped the sponge. He cupped her jaw with one wet, soapy hand, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't like the frantic, adrenaline-fueled kiss outside the burning mining camp. This was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly thorough. It was a claiming, an absolute surrender, a conversation spoken in breath and touch. Clara's wet arms reached up, wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer until his shirt was soaked through. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily, the air in the small room thick and charged. Silas reached into the pocket of his damp shirt. He pulled out a small object and held it in his palm. It was a ring, but it wasn't gold or set with a diamond. It was a thick, simple band of silver, crudely but carefully hammered into shape. "I don't have a preacher," Silas said, his voice a gravelly whisper, his gray eyes locked onto hers with piercing intensity. "And I don't have much use for the laws of men who burn down clinics. But I know what a vow is. I made a lot of bad ones in my life. I want to make a good one." Clara stared at the ring, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, mixing with the steam. "I traded my Pinkerton badge to a blacksmith in Cheyenne to melt down for the silver," Silas continued, his thumb brushing over the rough edge of the band. "It was the only thing of value I had from my past. I wanted it reshaped, like you reshaped me." He took her left hand, lifting it from the water. "I can't promise you a safe life, Clara. The world doesn't work that way. But I swear on my life, my soul, and every breath left in my lungs that I will stand between you and the dark. I will be your shield, your foundation, and your husband, until the earth reclaims us both." Clara looked at the scarred, beautiful, dangerous man kneeling beside a copper tub in the middle of a blizzard, offering her his entirely unvarnished soul. "And I swear," Clara said, her voice trembling but ringing with absolute certainty, "that I will be your sanctuary. I will heal your wounds. I will stand by your side in the fire and in the snow. And I will be your wife, Silas Vance, today and all the days of my life." Silas slid the silver band onto her ring finger. It was slightly imperfect, heavy, and absolutely perfect. He didn't wait for her to finish her bath. He lifted her out of the water, wrapping the warmed towel around her dripping body, and carried her to the large bed in the corner of the room. The wind screamed outside the thick timber walls, but inside, surrounded by the smell of pine smoke, soap, and each other, they sealed their vows. They didn't need a church. The Badlands had tested them, the fire had forged them, and the winter had bound them. They were married in the only way that mattered, in the absolute, unyielding devotion of two survivors who had finally found their way home. Spring in Wyoming was rarely a gentle awakening. It usually arrived as a violent, muddy struggle between the lingering frost and the desperate sun. It was late March, the time of the false thaws, when the daytime temperatures would melt the top layer of snow into a treacherous slush, only to freeze it solid again overnight. The roads were virtually impassable to anything lacking 4 hooves and a stubborn disposition. Silas and Clara were in the clinic's downstairs operating room taking inventory of the ether and carbolic acid supplies before the spring mining season began in earnest when the frantic pounding echoed through the heavy oak door. Silas exchanged a sharp look with Clara. He set down the crate he was holding and moved to the door, his hand resting instinctively on his hip, though he had left his gun belt upstairs. He slid back the iron bolt and pulled the door open. A man fell through the threshold, bringing a flurry of sleet and freezing rain with him. He was dressed in a heavy, expensive fur-lined coat that was currently soaked through and caked in mud. His face was gray, his lips blue from the cold, and his eyes were wide with a stark, unadulterated terror. He looked past Silas, his frantic gaze locking onto Clara, who had stepped out of the operating room. "Dr. Bowden," the man gasped, struggling to his knees. Thank God we made it." Clara went utterly still. The bottle of iodine she was holding nearly slipped from her fingers. She recognized him. 10 years, 1,000 miles, and a lifetime of trauma could not erase that face. It was Mayor Archibald Higgins of Cheyenne. The man who had stood on the boardwalk, a torch in his hand, and watched with cool approval as the town mob had set fire to her clinic. The man who had told her that a woman's place was in the parlor, not in the blood and viscera of a surgical theater. "Mayor Higgins," Clara said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the customary warmth she offered her patients. The air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. Silas, sensing the immediate shift in Clara, stepped forward, placing his large frame between his wife and the man on the floor. "You have exactly 10 seconds to state your business before I throw you back out into the sleet." "My wife," Higgins sobbed, grabbing the edge of Silas's coat, uncaring of the mud he smeared on it. "Martha, she's in the wagon. She's in the—" "The axle didn't break, but the horses are dead on their feet. She's having a baby. It's coming wrong. The doctor in Cheyenne, Dr. Miller." "Dr. Miller is a butcher who bought his degree," Clara said icily, stepping out from behind Silas. "He tried," Higgins wept, his arrogance entirely broken. "He tried for 2 days. Then he packed his bag and said there was nothing to be done. He said she would die and the child with her. He told me to fetch the undertaker." Higgins looked up at Clara, his face contorted in a mask of agonizing desperation. The powerful, judgmental politician was gone. In his place was a man watching his world end. "I heard the rumors," Higgins begged. "The miners talking about the woman in the Badlands who saved Thorne's boy. I hitched the wagon. I drove through the storm. Please, Clara. Dr. Bowden, I know what I did. I know what I allowed them to do to you. Let me burn for it in hell. But don't let Martha die. Don't let my baby die. I am begging you." Silence descended on the clinic, heavy and suffocating. Silas looked at Clara. He saw the ghosts swirling in her blue eyes. The memory of the flames, the shouts of the mob, the crushing, humiliating despair of being driven into the desert to die. This man represented every injustice, every patriarchal cruelty that had sought to destroy her. It would be so easy to close the door. It would be poetic justice. Let the man who burned her clinic bury his wife because he had driven away the only doctor capable of saving her. Silas waited. He would support whatever decision she made. If she said the word, Silas would carry Higgins out and bar the door, and he would sleep soundly that night. Clara looked at the weeping mayor. She looked at her bandaged hands, now healed into thin, silvery scars. Then she looked at the silver ring on her left hand. "I will be your sanctuary." She wasn't just a sanctuary for Silas. She was a sanctuary for anyone who crossed her threshold, because that was the oath she had taken. To deny care based on vengeance was to become the very monster the town of Cheyenne had accused her of being. "Silas," Clara said, her voice snapping with sudden absolute authority. "Get the stretcher. Bring the woman into the operating theater. Light every lamp in the room. I need boiling water, clean linens, and the obstetrical forceps from the top cabinet." Silas didn't hesitate. "Yes, Doc." He hauled Higgins to his feet and shoved him aside, rushing out into the sleeting rain toward the mud-caked wagon. The next 3 hours were a brutal, bloody war against the limitations of the human body. Martha Higgins was a fragile woman, delirious with pain and fever, entirely exhausted from 2 days of unproductive labor. The baby was presenting in a transverse lie, sideways, an almost guaranteed death sentence for both mother and child in the frontier territories. Clara stripped off her woolen dress, donning a clean white linen apron over her undershirt. She scrubbed her arms to the elbows in carbolic acid. She banished Mayor Higgins to the waiting room, refusing to let his panic infect her sterile environment. Silas acted as her surgical assistant. He didn't flinch at the blood or the screaming. He held Martha down when the pain made her thrash, offering her a piece of leather to bite down on, murmuring quiet, steady assurances in his deep voice. He anticipated Clara's needs, handing her clamps, sponges, and scalpels before she even had to ask. "The child is lodged," Clara said, her forehead gleaming with sweat. She had attempted an internal version, trying to manually turn the baby from the outside, but Martha's uterus was contracting too violently. "I have to perform a podalic version. I have to go inside, find the feet, and pull the child out backward. If I don't move fast, the umbilical cord will prolapse and the baby will suffocate." "Tell me what to do," Silas said steadily. "Hold her hips. Do not let her move. If she bucks, she could rupture her uterus." Clara took a deep breath. She submerged her arms in the basin of warm, sterilized water, and then she went to work. It was a terrifying, delicate procedure performed entirely by touch, guided only by her immense anatomical knowledge and sheer willpower. She closed her eyes, blocking out Martha's screams and the storm outside, visualizing the position of the child in the womb. She reached deep, her fingers searching, navigating past the uterine wall, finding the small, slick limbs of the infant. There. She grasped the tiny ankles. "I have the feet," Clara announced, her voice strained. "Silas, hold her." With a smooth, powerful, and terrifyingly precise motion, Clara pulled. She rotated the child inside the womb, fighting the crushing pressure of Martha's contractions. For one agonizing, endless minute, it felt as though she was tearing the woman apart. And then, with a sickening squelch, the baby's legs emerged. Clara didn't stop. She manipulated the shoulders, freeing the arms, and finally, with a delicate twist to protect the spine, she delivered the head. The child was blue and entirely limp. "Silas, clamp and cut the cord," Clara ordered, grabbing the infant. While Silas handled the umbilical cord, Clara carried the baby to the secondary table. She cleared the airway with a suction bulb, her hands moving with frantic, desperate speed. She rubbed the infant's back vigorously with a rough towel to stimulate the lungs. "Breathe," Clara whispered, her professional detachment cracking. "Come on, little one. Breathe." Nothing. The room was deathly silent, save for Martha's exhausted weeping. Clara placed her mouth over the baby's nose and mouth, gently puffing air into the tiny lungs. She did it again, and again. She pressed 2 fingers against the infant's chest, performing rapid, delicate compressions. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. But sometimes you had to fight God himself to do good. Suddenly, the infant's chest spasmed. A tiny, wet, furious cough erupted from the baby's lips. The blue skin rapidly flooded with a bright, angry pink. The cough turned into a wail, a loud, indignant, miraculous scream that shattered the tension in the room like glass. Clara slumped against the table, her entire body trembling, a single tear cutting a clean line through the sweat and blood on her cheek. Silas walked over to her. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his large, steady hand around the back of her neck, grounding her, letting her know she was safe. "It's a girl," Clara whispered, looking at the screaming infant. An hour later, the operating room was cleaned. Martha Higgins, pale but alive and resting comfortably, was asleep on a clean cot, her healthy daughter swaddled tightly and tucked against her breast. Clara walked out into the waiting room, stripping off her blood-stained apron. Silas stood by the door, a silent sentinel. Mayor Higgins stood up from the bench, his hat clutched in his trembling hands. He looked at Clara, his eyes begging for the verdict. "Your wife will recover, Mr. Mayor," Clara said quietly. "And you have a healthy, loud daughter. You may go in and see them, but keep it brief. They both need rest." Higgins fell to his knees on the wooden floorboards. He buried his face in his hands, weeping with the ragged, ugly sounds of a man who had stared into the abyss and been pulled back. "Thank you," Higgins sobbed. "God forgive me, thank you. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve your mercy." Clara looked down at him. She felt no triumph, no gloating. She only felt a profound, weary peace. The ghosts of Cheyenne that had haunted her for a year were finally truly laid to rest. Higgins looked up, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. Dr. Bowden, Clara, when the storm clears, when Martha is well enough to travel, I want you to come back with us to Cheyenne. Clara frowned slightly. Excuse me? The town has changed, Higgins pleaded, desperation making him speak rapidly. Dr. Miller is a fraud. Everyone knows it now. We need a real physician. I will personally fund a new clinic for you. The finest brick building in the city center. State-of-the-art equipment. I will ensure the town council issues a public apology. You will be respected. You will be wealthy. You can have your life back. It was everything she had ever wanted. It was the dream she had driven a wagon into the Badlands to find. Vindication, respect, a civilized practice, and a total humiliating victory over the men who had wronged her. Clara looked at the wealthy, powerful politician kneeling on her floor, offering her the world on a silver platter. Then she turned her head. She looked at Silas. He was leaning against the door frame, his arms crossed over his chest, his gray eyes watching her intently. He wasn't making a sound. He wasn't trying to influence her. If she wanted to go to Cheyenne, he would pack the wagon, escort her there, and walk away so his reputation wouldn't tarnish her new life. He loved her enough to let her go. Clara looked at the heavy timber walls of the clinic they had built with their own hands. She thought of the mustangs grazing by the spring, the smell of pine smoke, the absolute terrifying freedom of the wilderness. She thought of the silver ring on her finger, forged from a killer's badge, given to her by the best man she had ever known. She turned back to the mayor of Cheyenne. My life is not in your city, Mr. Higgins, Clara said, her voice ringing with clear, beautiful certainty. My life is here. This clinic is my practice. These people are my patients. Higgins stared at her, uncomprehending. But the isolation, the danger. You are a brilliant woman. You belong in civilization. I am exactly where I belong, Clara replied softly. She walked past the kneeling mayor and crossed the room to Silas. She took his hand, weaving her fingers through his, feeling the rough calluses and the steady warmth. Silas looked down at her, a slow, wondrous smile breaking across his scarred face, lighting up the gray of his eyes like the sun breaking through a storm cloud. We built a sanctuary in the dust, Mr. Mayor, Clara said, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder, and I would not trade one handful of this dirt for all the brick in Cheyenne. Now go see your daughter. My husband and I have a clinic to run. Spring in the Wyoming Badlands did not arrive with a gentle whisper. It erupted with a desperate, violent thirst for life. By late May, the scars of the Great Canyon fire had been swallowed by an aggressive ocean of green. Wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, purple lupine, and yellow sweet clover pushed their way fiercely through the nutrient-rich ash, painting the charred slopes in defiant, vibrant colors. The underground spring, swollen by the heavy winter snowmelt, had expanded into a wide, crystalline pool that mirrored the boundless western sky. The clinic at the edge of the oasis was thriving. Clara's decision to stay had cemented her reputation not just as a brilliant physician, but as a permanent, immovable pillar of the territory. The hostility that had once chased her from Cheyenne was replaced by a quiet, absolute reverence from the locals. She was the lady of the Badlands, and her clinic was sacred ground. Yet for Silas Vance, the final act of his own healing was not found inside the pristine walls of the operating room, but out in the dust of the corral. It was late afternoon. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the canyon floor. Silas stood in the center of the heavy timber corral, a coiled lariat resting loosely in his scarred left hand. Facing him, 20 feet away, was the black Mustang stallion. It was the same horse Silas had been trying to gentle on the day Jessup and Thorne's men had arrived to burn him out. For a year, the stallion had remained wild, a magnificent, terrifying creature of pure instinct and untamed fury. Silas had worked with him almost every day, never using a whip, never raising his voice, offering only infinite, grueling patience. The horse was a mirror of the man Silas used to be, cornered, violent, expecting pain, and ready to deal death to survive. Clara stood on the wide front porch of the clinic, wiping her hands on a towel, having just finished setting a rancher's dislocated shoulder. She leaned against the wooden railing, her blue eyes fixed on the corral. She held her breath, recognizing the profound weight of this moment. Silas did not move toward the horse. He simply stood his ground, radiating a calm, unyielding presence. He lowered his eyes, removing the direct predatory stare that wild animals perceived as a threat. He waited. The stallion snorted, tossing his massive head, his ebony coat gleaming with sweat. He pawed the dirt, a bluff charge building in his heavy chest. "Easy," Silas murmured, the gravelly vibration of his voice carrying across the still air. "Nobody's hurting you today. The war's over." For 10 minutes, neither man nor beast moved. It was a silent battle of wills, fought not with muscle, but with trust. Slowly, the stallion stopped pawing the ground. His ears, pinned flat against his skull in aggression, flicked forward. He took a hesitant, trembling step toward Silas, then another. Silas didn't raise his hand. He let the horse close the distance. The stallion stopped inches from Silas's chest. The massive animal lowered his head, his velvet muzzle hovering just above Silas's hands, inhaling the scent of the man who had fed him, watered him, and refused to break him with cruelty. With agonizing slowness, Silas raised his right hand. He didn't reach for the halter. He simply placed his palm flat against the stallion's thick, muscular neck. The horse flinched, muscles bunching, but he didn't bolt. He let out a long, heavy exhale, the hot breath ruffling Silas's shirt, and leaned his immense weight ever so slightly into the touch. Silas closed his eyes. A profound, shuddering breath racked his broad shoulders. He slipped the halter over the stallion's head and buckled it. There was no fight. There was no panic. The wild thing had finally, willingly, surrendered to the sanctuary. Silas led the black stallion out of the corral gate and walked him toward the clinic porch. Clara stepped down the wooden stairs to meet them, her face radiant with a quiet, overwhelming pride. "You did it," Clara said softly, reaching out to gently stroke the stallion's nose. The horse nickered, accepting her touch with a calm curiosity. "We did it," Silas corrected, his pale gray eyes locking onto hers. "He just needed to know he had a place to belong where nobody was going to shoot at him. Took me a while to figure that out for myself, too." Clara smiled, a tender, brilliant expression that still had the power to stop Silas's heart. "I think you figured it out just fine, cowboy." Silas handed the lead rope to one of the young stable hands they had hired for the spring, instructing him to brush the stallion down and give him an extra ration of oats. Then he turned back to his wife. He reached out, his thumbs gently tracing the faint, silvery scars on the backs of her hands, the physical proof of the fire they had walked through together. "You look tired, Doc," Silas murmured, noting the faint shadows beneath her eyes. "You've been working too hard. 3 surgeries this week and half the county coming to you with spring fevers. You need to rest." "I am perfectly fine, Silas," Clara deflected, though she leaned gratefully into his solid warmth as he wrapped an arm around her waist and guided her up the porch steps. "You're not eating enough," Silas pressed, his protective instincts flaring. He guided her to the wooden bench on the porch and gently pushed her down by the shoulders. "You skipped breakfast yesterday, and I saw you push your plate away at dinner. If you won't doctor yourself, I'll have to tie you to a chair and feed you myself." Clara looked up at him, a sudden bright amusement dancing in her eyes. "Are you threatening a licensed physician, Mr. Vance?" "I'm threatening my wife," Silas rumbled, though there was no heat in it, only a deep, abiding adoration. He crouched down in front of her, resting his forearms on her knees, bringing his face level with hers. "I promise to be your shield, Clara. That includes shielding you from your own stubbornness. Tell me what's wrong." The amusement faded from Clara's face, replaced by an emotion so vast and overwhelming it made her breath hitch. She reached out, framing his scarred, beloved face with her hands. "Nothing is wrong, Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fierce, sudden joy. "Nothing will ever be wrong again." She took his right hand, the large, rough hand that had once held guns and dealt death, and pressed it flat against her lower abdomen. "I haven't been eating because my stomach refuses to settle in the mornings," Clara said, her blue eyes shining with unshed tears. "And I am tired because my body is currently occupied with a very demanding task." Silas froze. The world around him seemed to stop spinning. The rustle of the cottonwood leaves, the distant whinny of the horses, the rushing sound of the spring, it all faded into absolute, roaring silence. He stared at her, his mind struggling to grasp the magnitude of what she was telling him. He looked down at his hand resting against her stomach. "Clara." His voice was a raw, broken rasp. "A baby, Silas," Clara laughed, the sound bubbling over with tears. "We are going to have a child. Come winter, this cabin is going to be very loud, and we are going to need a smaller cradle." Silas dropped to his knees in the dirt. For a man who had faced down firing squads, wildfires, and the worst monsters the frontier had to offer without blinking, the revelation unmade him completely. He pressed his face against her knees, his massive shoulders shaking as a lifetime of grief, guilt, and isolation finally fractured and washed away. He had spent his life convinced he was a poison to the world, a barren, violent thing that destroyed whatever it touched. And now the woman who had walked into his wasteland was telling him he had created life. Clara leaned forward, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck, burying her face in his hair, crying with him. "I didn't think—" Silas choked out, his voice muffled against her skirts. "I didn't think I was allowed to have this. Someone like me." "Someone like you," Clara said fiercely, pulling his head up so she could look into his eyes, "is exactly who deserves this. You are a good man, Silas Vance. The best man I know. And our child is going to be so incredibly proud to call you father." Silas reached up, wiping the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs, though his own face was wet. He looked at the clinic, the oasis, the safe haven they had carved out of rock and fire. "A child," Silas whispered, awe replacing the shock. He let out a wet, genuine laugh that echoed across the canyon. "A baby in the Badlands." "They will be strong," Clara promised, resting her forehead against his. "They will know how to survive, because they will have you to teach them. And they will know how to heal, because they will have me." Silas stood up, pulling Clara with him. He didn't just hug her. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around on the porch until she shrieked with laughter, the sound ringing out like a church bell in the twilight. When he finally set her down, the sun had dipped below the canyon walls, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of violet, gold, and indigo. The evening star was just beginning to burn through the fading light. Silas wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest, resting his hands over hers on her stomach. They stood together on the porch, looking out over the sanctuary they had built. The water of the spring babbled quietly in the dusk. The horses were settled and safe. The ghosts of Cheyenne, the Pinkertons, and the men who had tried to break them were nothing but dust on the wind. "You staked your future on me, Clara Bowden," Silas murmured, kissing the shell of her ear, his heart overflowing with a peace so absolute it felt holy. "And you gave me a life I never dreamed existed." Clara leaned back into his embrace, her hands covering his, her soul perfectly, finally at rest. "No, Silas," she corrected softly, watching the stars bloom over the Wyoming sky. "We didn't stake our futures. We built one, together." And in the heart of the Badlands, surrounded by the fierce, unforgiving beauty of the frontier, the oasis bloomed, ready to welcome the dawn. On this channel, we share stories of the Wild West, cowboys, love stories, family bonds, humanity, and the quiet kindness that changes lives. If you felt something from this story, leave a comment. hit like, share it, and subscribe to join us on this journey. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
As the dust settles over the Badlands and the echoes of gunfire fade into the vast silence of the frontier, what remains is not the memory of violence, but the quiet, enduring power of human choice. This story is not merely about a cowboy defending his land or a doctor saving lives under impossible conditions. It is, at its heart, a reflection on what it truly means to be human in a world that often demands we become something less. Silas Vance was a man shaped by violence, a man who believed his past had already written the ending of his story. He carried guilt like a second skin, convinced that redemption was a luxury he no longer deserved. And yet, when faced with the ultimate test, not just of survival but of character, he chose differently. He chose restraint over instinct, protection over destruction, and ultimately, life over death. His journey reminds us that no matter how far we have fallen, we are never beyond the reach of change. Redemption is not given, it is chosen, one decision at a time. Clara Bowden, on the other hand, represents a different kind of strength, the quiet, unwavering courage to stand by one's principles in the face of injustice. She had every reason to turn her back on a world that had wronged her, every justification to let bitterness take root. But instead, she chose compassion. She chose to heal even those who did not deserve it, to save lives regardless of past grievances. Her character teaches us that true strength is not found in retaliation, but in mercy. In a world driven by vengeance, choosing empathy is the bravest act of all. Together, Silas and Clara embody a powerful truth, that healing and redemption are not solitary journeys. Sometimes, it takes another person to reflect the humanity we have forgotten in ourselves. Through trust, sacrifice, and shared hardship, they did more than survive. They built something meaningful, a sanctuary, a life, a future. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson this story offers, that even in the harshest environments, whether it is a drought-stricken canyon or the emotional wasteland of our own past, we still have the power to create something good. Love can grow in the most unlikely places. Compassion can break cycles of violence, and even the most broken souls can find peace when they choose to stand for something greater than themselves. So as you walk away from this story, consider this. What choices define you? When faced with hardship, do you become hardened? Or do you become human? Because in the end, it is not the world that shapes us, but the decisions we make within it. And sometimes, the greatest victory is not in defeating others, but in saving the parts of ourselves we thought were already lost.